Hi, everybody. Welcome to a new Rebalance talk today with Mimi Scheller. Great to have you here with us, Mimi.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
It's just wonderful to finish these first 10 inspirational talks with you. I think you are well known, but let me just introduce you because what you have been doing in the last years are really relevant for us. So you are a PhD professor of sociology and founding director of the Center of Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in Philadelphia, founding co-editor of the journal Mobilities, associate editor of Transfer, and past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic and Mobility, everything closely related to our area of interest. You helped to establish the interdisciplinary field of mobilities research in the last year, and you are author and co-editor of a number of books, 15 in total. The last one, Advanced Introduction to Mobilities, just published 1 month ago. And one book that has been very influential, and we will ask you about this one in this talk, which is called Mobility Justice, the Politics of Movement in the Age of Extremes. So a lot of work in the last years, Mimi.
Yes.
Let me begin the conversation by asking you from the word mobility itself, which is a new concept you helped a lot to popularize and be a reference in the academic world, but is also important concept on the business sector. We talk not of transport planning, we talk about mobility as a service. Also from the institutional point of view, during the commission, DG Trend, the General Directory of Transport and Energy, changed its name. Now it's called DG Move, General Directory of Mobility. So what is the meaning of this change? It's really something important. So is something deep in this change? I guess it's not just rhetorical. There is something deep inside this change.
Yeah, it's a really important development, and it's amazing how it happened across multiple different fields at the same time. And just to contextualize my timing in what we called the mobility turn is I was at Lancaster University working with the sociologist John Urry, and he had published in 2000 his book Sociology Beyond Societies, and he was starting to talk about mobility. And when I arrived at Lancaster University in 1999, we started a conversation about mobility, and that led eventually to our article that we called The New Mobilities Paradigm. And that came out in 2006 in the journal Environment and Planning A as part of a special issue on mobilities and materialities. But at that very kind of moment, there were other scholars working on mobility in the fields of geography and anthropology, and there was a longer tradition of thinking about it. But when we published the New Mobilities Paradigm, in the business world, people had started shortly after that talking about a new mobility paradigm, and they meant something completely different. They meant a change in the system of mobility, of automobility. And we started to see car companies like Renault in France and like Ford in the United States. They both said, we're no longer a car company, we're a mobility company. And it was the beginning of this transition towards thinking about mobility as a service, mobility as more than the automobile, mobility as more than transportation. And what was driving a lot of those changes was mobile communication technology. So the old industrial car producing companies were starting to see the rise of the communications companies, and not just the internet, but the mobile internet. And so they started to talk about the car as a platform for the mobile internet. And that was, it hadn't really happened yet, but it was starting to happen, that mobile communication was getting more and more integrated into physical mobility systems. So not just the car, but then the entire urban system of mobility. and what started to then be called smart transportation or smart cities, mobile apps and mobile services for accessing different kinds of mobility. So that was driving the sort of change in the business world terminology. We were coming at it from this kind of change in the academic world that we called the new mobilities paradigm. And then eventually governments and sort of, city planning offices and places like that also started to use the term mobility. So there was a lot of changes going on that were part of that move, but I would still say the theoretical move that we're talking about is much more than that. It's not just about the change of the transportation system.
Okay, I see. Let's see the implication of all of this in the mindsets of transport policymakers and transport planners. Because by reading your books and the books by your colleagues, what we see is a criticism of the traditional, let's say, welfare economics mindset when we assess the public interest of transport policies. Let's say, reading you, it seems that social utility, rational choice, all these concepts have to be changed to include the meanings of moving, the meanings of traveling, instead of just observed behaviors or quantitative measurements. We have to take into consideration qualitative issues, studies over empirical facts. So there is something very deep on the change from transport efficiency to sustainable and inclusive mobility.
Right. And I agree with that. The one part I would disagree with is it's not a movement away from empirical facts, but I'll come back to that. But what you're getting at is that we were critical of transportation planning that used the predict and provide model, and engineering that uses the level of service measurement, which is all about the flow of traffic, right? And that, well, we think there'll be this much population growth, and so we're going to build, more roads because there will be more cars, and so we need to provide for that growth. And that increasingly became untenable because what we saw, especially in the United States, was that the more you widened highways, the more you added lanes, the more traffic you induced. And so that whole critique of induced traffic demand was something that was happening in the transportation world at the same time that there was a call for more sustainable mobilities, right? Low carbon transitions, and how were we going to get there? And so a debate was emerging around how we plan for transportation in a way that will not just keep inducing more demand for cars. And so, I mean, we were not transportation planners, and we were not exactly working in that field. We were sort of adjacent to it, but we were watching and listening to what was happening there. And in our field, what we were calling for in mobilities research was, as you say, a more qualitative and more complex and multidimensional understanding of mobilities. And that's not to say it's not empirical, because we use what we call a variety of mixed mobile methods. And mobile methods are getting at the idea that transportation is not just, as you said, it's not just about efficiency of movement from A to B. And it's not just about that you're trying to access something at either end, right? Home to work, or access to education or healthcare or some other service, but that the act of moving itself is, as you mentioned, full of meaning. And it's what Tim Cresswell calls a constellation of mobilities. There's movement, there's meaning, and then there's the embodied practices that bring that together. So we wanted to try to find ways to study that in a more holistic way, but also the other side is to look at complex intersecting systems of different mobilities and mobility regimes that control and sort of determine who has access to differential mobilities. Like, mobilities are always uneven and differentiated. And so there's not just, the other problem in a lot of planning discourses is they take a sort of unmarked, neutral kind of individual actor. And what we were saying is that people don't actually work like that, and that we're actually embedded in social relations and different kinds of embodied relations with space, and those are marked by gender and race and ethnicity and nationality, age, disabilities. And so we all move within that kind of embodied constellation, but also we face different kinds of what we call kinopolitical relations as we move through that space. And to put that in really simple terms, like the debate here in the US, which is about what Charles T. Brown calls arrested mobility of Black and brown people in the United States when the police stop them, call their cars into question, force people out of their cars, and it leads to violence and deaths and murders by police of Black and brown drivers, which is epidemic right now in the United States, as we've all heard about. That's a different kind of relationship to that kinopolitical formation of mobility that those individuals face. So it's much more than a question of, okay, how am I going to get to work today? Which is like what transport planners seem to focus on.
I see. I'm not a sociologist, so you have to allow me to make a simple question in relation to the contribution you are doing in relation to the history of sociology, because I'm ignorant, I can't take this risk. Reading Lefebvre somehow introduced a space in the society of classes, kind of society of places. Then Castells somehow introduced the idea of networks and studied the society of networks, or the society of flows. Also, Simon Bauman analyzed the fluid society. It seems that your work is closely related to Castells and Bauman, or what is the relation you have with Castells and Bauman, and what is the difference, let's say? Yeah.
So first of all, I would say we're actually more closely related to Lefebvre. So Lefebvre's production of space, right, was very important. And also the way in which it was taken up within the Anglophone world, and in particular within British geography, I would say, was via the work of Doreen Massey, and as well as John Urry, who, in the 1990s were talking about the spatial turn and the sort of production of space, the meaning of space, the embodied practices of space. And that influenced a lot of geographers as well as sociologists in that period. And when we get to the late 1990s and Castells' Network Society comes out, what he's responding to is the information kind of, age, the rise of the internet. And of course, John Urry had also written about that in his work, Economies of Signs and Space. But I would say, and then Bauman's kind of liquid modernity and other work was appearing in the early 2000s. And that period was one in which there were these European theorists who were making sort of certain kinds of big claims, right, about this giant change of our era, our new society. And information and the Network Society was very much about the impact of information technologies and this kind of networked social connections that were somehow imagined as lifted out of space, right? The space of flows that was not connected to the space of places. And what's different in what we were doing is that I was coming out of a completely different theoretical tradition. I was coming out of Caribbean studies and feminist and post-colonial theory. And it's really important to understand that the mobilities paradigm came at this intersection of my more transatlantic, Atlantic world, feminist, post-colonial, and Caribbean theory, meeting up with these kind of big European theories of the new society and criticizing them and saying that they're taking a very particular view of things and they're universalizing it, and that they're missing so much of what's happening. So number one, they're missing the fact that the world has long been very mobile, and that those mobilities were deeply connected with immobilities and with what we called moorings, and that there were these deep historical structures that were colonial structures, imperial, racial capitalism that had built the world as it is now, right? When you talk about the history of like modern society and European society, you can't disconnect it from the slave societies that took people from Africa, enslaved them, brought them to the Caribbean, moved people around within those slave societies and North America. And remembering that North America, I'm from Philadelphia, I'm here now, that Philadelphia and New York were the largest cities in the Americas in the 18th century, along with Kingston, Jamaica, and Port-au-Prince, Haiti, right? Which were bigger than any other North American city. And so this was a world of mobilities, a world of ships, a world of migration, a world of vast inequalities, but produced by flows, if we want to call it flows, I mean, I don't know if that's the best word for it, not just of people, but of goods, right? Of plantation commodities and of capital and the profit that was being wrung from the colonies, which also was based on the genocide and removal of indigenous people. So when I hear, oh, at the late 20th century, the world is in motion now, as if it was not 100 years or 200 years before, I dismiss that theorist and say, well, that's just incorrect. The formation, the power structure of mobilities and immobilities has shifted. It's changed, obviously. And maybe it's accelerated and intensified by certain kinds of information technologies. But back in the 19th century, people thought that the clipper ship was like the greatest, fastest thing ever. And the telegraph was like a fantastic speeding up of communication. So there was already this sense. And so what we talk about is the way in which speed and slowness are constructed in different kinds of narratives. So I understand some of the social theorists of the late 20th and early 21st century of constructing certain kinds of narratives of mobility and speed and acceleration. And so I want to look at how they're constructing that narrative, what they're including, what they're excluding. And so so the new mobilities paradigm is not another claim that the world is mobile now. That's not what it's about. And it's always about this relationship of power and what we call kinopolitics that are shaping different discourses as well as practices of mobility.
Let me quote you in this, and maybe you can further explain this quote. You said, the focus is not on the transnational movement of people carrying cultural practices with them across borders, but rather on the ways in which, from earliest to most recent time, cultural practices have crossed boundaries of place that human communities have constructed, unsettling social and cultural relations, keeping even especially rooted cultures in motion. Is this the idea you were explaining right now?
Yeah, so that's related to an idea of trying to break out of what we call sedentary narratives of the world. So in a sedentary perspective, and I partly thank anthropologists who also, have talked about this, like Noel Salazar and Nina Glick-Schiller, who worked on transnational anthropology, was that in a sedentary perspective, we assume that first there are bounded entities, right? There's a state, there's a nation, and then people moved, and there was like migrants coming or people going out to colonies or something like that. But in a mobilities perspective, we say the mobility comes first. Everything is mobile first. And Thomas Nail has written a very interesting philosophical book about this called Being in Motion. This is like he describes it as a mobile ontology. There's different debates about how we want to use that word, but I'll just say that we begin with an understanding that people have always moved, and the world has been made up of different kinds of movement of people, of animals, of goods, of crops, and that at a certain point, nation states were created out of that through long historical processes of warfare and what my dissertation supervisor, Charles Tilley, wrote about as capital and coercion. So you had, some states formed a territorial form, others formed these sort of long distance trading networks. But in any case, the modern nation state system emerged out of that. But within that, there were always mobile people. And there have always been people that exceed the boundaries of the nation. And so that gives you a different way of sort of thinking about the histories of mobility and what has changed over time, and to understand that they're not a dichotomy, right? That they're always within mobilities, there are immobilities and stillnesses. And within stillness, there is always some forms of mobility. And to try to sort of think about it in a less dichotomous way is helpful for understanding the complex human relations that are happening both in the past and today.
Okay. Do you agree that there are anthropological limits to mobility? Cesare Marchetti once suggested that people move 1 hour per day in average, let's say all together, all combined, and 10% of the income available is allocated to transport. And this is, they say, a rule through all civilizations we know all across. So in a way, this rule will confirm your idea that always we were mobile, just that now we have faster and cheaper transportation means. So maybe we make more kilometers within the same hour and the same 10%. Do you think this is oversimplistic, or there is some interest on this?
Yeah. No, I think that's way too oversimplistic, because first I would say, who's the we here? Who's when you say we have this kind of time and mobility budget? Let's just take the United States right now. Okay, there are millions of people who are unemployed and do not have jobs. So they're not in this system of like moving to a certain amount of time to get to work. There are millions of people who are jailed and in prison or on parole, and whose mobilities are tightly controlled. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are working in the gig economy, who spend their entire workday moving, right, to try to find work, do work, get work, wait for work. There are tens of thousands, if not more, people living in their vehicles right now in the United States. Then there's all the homeless people. Then, I mean, you could go on and on, like, who's the we here? Like that are the subject of this.
Actually, nobody, yes, nobody. Nobody. Everybody's different, yes.
Yeah, so everybody's different. And then when we go back and say, okay, that's just right now, then we talk about the past. And often those measures, they say, well, our grandfathers went this far, and then our fathers went this far, and now we go this far in this much time, but our budgets are similar. Well, I'm like, okay, what if your grandfather was a sailor on a ship around the world? What if your great or grandfather was enslaved on a plantation? What if how about your grandmothers? What were your grandmothers doing? And how much did that change between what your mother did and if you're, female? All of these questions become very different. What if you're like doing multiple journeys? What if you're working multiple jobs? As many Americans have at least 2 jobs to survive. So yeah, way too universal to make that kind of claim.
Yeah, I understand. Then let's go to the mobility justice. You identify 3 scales of justice, if I understand right. An urban crisis of pollution and congestion, which means injustice at the street level. A global refugee crisis of borders and humanitarianism is, let's say, an injustice at the national state border level. And a climate crisis of global warming and decarbonization, which is a global injustice. But before going to these 3 scales of justice, let me ask you about the concept of justice. So what is the meaning of justice for you? What do you mean by justice? Because, there are many different concepts of justice included,
Yeah.
related. Which one is the one you mean?
Okay. So when I started using the term mobility justice, initially I think I was inspired by the idea of spatial justice, and then an understanding that that was too still, and that I wanted to take spatial justice and think about moving it, and what would it mean if we thought of spatial justice on the move, and so that would be mobility justice. But then when I wrote the book, I thought, okay, I need to get a more deeper dive and systematic way of thinking about mobility justice. So I went back to my undergraduate years, where I took a course with Michael Sandel, the famous theorist of justice. And the course is called Justice, and hundreds of students have taken it over the years, thousands. And we started there. We read John Rawls' Theory of Justice, and then we read Robert Nozick, and then we read Michael Sandel, and then I went on to also then read other theories of justice and critiques of some of the theories of justice, for example, by feminist thinkers. And so I was kind of building on this kind of layer of thinking about justice and bringing it up to the current debates about environmental justice also, and climate justice. And so what became important for me in thinking that through was that when we talk about mobility, many people begin with the idea of transportation. And we've heard of the movement for transportation justice, which calls for more equitable transportation. And in my mind, I understood that that was a question of distributive justice. So distributive justice says, okay, everybody should get, fair access and distribution to transit and to transportation. So if it's a bus or subway, or if there's a car system, it should not exclude other forms of mobility. So that transportation justice policy was all around distributive justice. But when you look at other theories of justice, they next turn to procedural justice within deliberations. So what deliberative justice and procedural justice. And in deliberative justice, you need to think about who's included in the decision-making about transportation, right? Who's at the table? Who are the deciders? And that's where there was a very important movement was emerging in the United States and across the Americas. As I was writing mobility justice, I became aware of an organization called the Untokening, and a movement in California called People for Mobility Justice. And they were working in that transportation space, but they were calling for an opening of decision-making to more people. So Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, people with disabilities, to whose views they felt were not represented in the transportation planning circles, and many of them were people of color and women themselves. So once you get into deliberative and procedural justice, you would come up to things like for example, the feminist theorist of justice, Nancy Fraser, who critiqued Habermasian communicative discourse, because Habermas, somewhat like John Rawls, you could say, kind of imagined a ideal situation of deliberation, like where we will put aside our embodied differences. We will put aside gender and race and class, and we will have this moment of ideal communication. Rawls called it the veil of ignorance. Habermas, wanted us to make, more fair processes within that communicative space. But Nancy Fraser and other feminists said, we are embodied. We cannot just put aside our bodies. And the whole theory of justice as blind is based on the assumption of a masculine individual, rational, white, kind of citizen actor. And so the world is more complex than that. And so to open up deliberation and procedural justice, we also need to think about what then is called epistemic justice. Epistemic justice means we come with different epistemological understandings of our world, and we need to find ways to deliberate across those if we want fair outcomes and to be inclusive of those. And many thinkers have kind of brought that into both feminist thinking and indigenous philosophies, like Arturo Escobar's work on designs for the pluriverse, which is like that we need more pluriversal ways of thinking. So all of those different ideas kind of come into mobility justice. And in particular, in working that through, I realized that most theories of justice take place in this like imaginary blank space, this imaginary like room where these deliberations are supposedly happening, or where decisions are being made about fairness. And I realized that they have no sense of mobility in them. So I say that justice itself has to be embodied, embedded, and understood as a mobile institutional practice, and that it requires various kinds of assembly. And there's various theorists who've written about this, you know, what it means to assemble and to occupy space and to be part of a sort of physically embodied process, which requires mobility and the right to assemble. And so those are some of the sort of roots of thinking about mobility justice.
Okay, let's go to these three different scales: the street, the country, and the planet. Maybe you can further explain a little bit by what do you mean by these three different scales and the role of mobility to understand this crisis?
Yeah, so in the three ideas you just talked about, I kind of used to frame, in a way, the opening of the book Mobility Justice as the idea that there's a triple crisis. And I was trying to think about a way to explain why, when I talk about mobility, I'm not just talking about transportation, which some people might assume, and that the crisis we experience, like, yes, there is this crisis of the street in terms of congestion, pollution. How are we going to have more sustainable, low carbon mobilities? Many cities and many activists are talking about that as a sustainability crisis at that level of transportation. But then I wanted to say, when we want to think about that question of crisis, we also might at the same time think about the crisis of borders and movement of people more widely, not just in a city, but across the world. And that there's many political debates about that right now. And I don't call it a migration crisis so much as I call it a humanitarian reception crisis, right? Like the United States right now accepts fewer refugees than almost anywhere in the world. I mean, it's ridiculous. And we also find that our population is shrinking or growing less slowly than ever before than since the 1930s. So it's not that the country is full and there's migrants pushing at the borders. No, it's that we've shut the borders, we've kept out refugees, we've closed down our legal migration system. And so we've produced this crisis ourselves. And this is happening all around the world, this kind of closure of borders and also these new systems of migration management and so on. But then if we're going to talk about the low carbon transition and the global mobility crisis, we also need to talk about what I call this kind of planetary crisis of climate change, right? That we're killing the planet, right? We're in the midst of ecocide, a huge die-off of living things. And that too, I see as a mobility related crisis, because when we think about the global inequalities and the ways in which we move, we're using up too much energy. And by we, I mean we in the sort of global north or in the wealthier positions that I call the kinetic elite. The kinetic elite are the ones who are using up too much energy and too many resources. And are causing the climate crisis, as well as, you know, the fossil fuel companies, which have been in denial of the climate crisis and campaigning against public understanding of it. So those, I see them as a triple mobility crisis, and I see them as all intertwined and related, because the way we use too much energy and drive too, you know, cars that are too big and use too much fossil fuel is causing a destabilization of the climate. The destabilization of the climate is driving refugees and migration processes in many parts of the world. So there's a loop of connection between all of these mobility crises.
There are two concepts that you have explained a number of articles and books. I would like you to explain for us. One is the secessionist mobility, and the other is the commons, inspired by Silvia Federici. Let's begin by the secessionist mobility. What do you mean by that? And why is this relevant?
I read about the idea of secessionist mobility in some work by Henderson, whose last name I'm blanking out on, apologies. And originally there was an article that talked about how white inhabitants of the city of Atlanta, they moved out to the suburbs when they got what we call white flight, right? When a city reached a certain tipping point and the Black population was growing because of migration and different processes of where jobs were moving, and whites left the North American cities, not just Atlanta, it's happened in many other cities. And instead of calling it white flight, Henderson calls it secessionist automobility. And the idea was that the sort of middle and upper middle class white population, when in moving to the suburbs, took the tax base also away from these cities, and the taxes that support our urban infrastructure moved to the suburbs. And yet they still wanted access to the city. They might still have jobs in the city. And so like here in Philadelphia, if the suburbs are very wealthy generally, and people have cars and they use their cars and they want highways and they want easy access in and out of the city, but they don't want their taxes to support this urban public transit system. The school system is not supported. The healthcare system is very differentiated. So we ended up with this racial divide that you could think of as seceding from the urban public sphere, right? And moving to the suburbs. And of course, in Atlanta, it has a resonance with the story of the South, right? The South during the Civil War seceded from the Union. So there's this kind of historical memory of secession as something that white people did to try to preserve white privilege. And so moving to the suburbs is a way of preserving white privilege. Now, fast forward that to today. Those, as I call them, with their privilege, tried to protect their bubbles of safety, right? And that could be by staying at home. That could be by going to their vacation home somewhere else. That could be by renting an Airbnb somewhere, you know, whatever. But those are different forms of secessionist mobility as well. Going to an island, having a private island, or having islands where you now can use your vaccine passport, and there might be an invitation to nomadic workers to come for 6 months to work, for example, in Barbados, right? Those are all forms of secessionist mobility.
I see. And then the commons, the idea of the commons.
Oh, and the commons. Okay. So in thinking about what do we need to do to fix our mobility crises, I started to move at the end of the book, Mobility Justice, towards thinking about the idea of a mobile commons. And what does a mobile commons mean? Or what some call commoning mobilities. If you go back to the literature on commons and commoning, often we think of the commons as like a resource, a place, right? Like a forest, right? Or a park or something like that that's sort of held in common, or maybe the ocean, all right, fishing as a kind of commons in the classic work by Elinor Ostrom. And there have been, Elinor Ostrom's work on common pool resources was a critique of Gareth Harding's argument of the tragedy of the commons. And the classic idea in economics was that when you have a commons, everybody comes in and takes everything and then it collapses, right? The resource is gone. But Elinor Ostrom argued that actually people come up pretty regularly with ways of sharing. There's a sharing system, and we create rules and we don't take too much, and we make sure there's enough to replenish a forest or a fishery or whatever. And so that idea was taken up by other theorists, and I got interested in the work of Silvia Federici and George Cafensis, who also started writing about the commons. And Federici's work came out of the Italian Wages for Housework campaign, and the idea that women are doing all of this reproductive labor and all of this free, like unpaid work, and that there are many ways in which we can think about all of the kinds of things that people do that are not part of the paid work world that we might call like private business. And they're also not part of the state paid public business world or public goods, but there's this in-between space, and neither private nor public, in between is commons. And you can trace that idea back in history to many, many different ways in which there were peoples and groups in history who were outside the kind of formal system of state, public, and private business. And I was trying to pick up on that idea and think about it then as what would it mean to mobilize that idea now, and to think of our uses of space as a kind of mobile commoning, that we can move through the world and do it in a way that is not just a mobility as a service business, and is not public transport, and is not private automobiles, but we think of this shared spaces of movement and how we can preserve them for others. And share them means to be more careful, to move more carefully. And in doing that, to make room not just for other human beings to move, but non-human beings, animals, natural entities, and natural places themselves, and what we call resources, right? To be careful, more careful with all of those things through mobile commoning would be this kind of limitation on ourselves. And that, I believe, frames it really differently than current sort of debates about how are we going to have low carbon sustainable transitions, right? And they're often posed in a kind of economic framework, like, oh, well, this will create jobs. We're going to have electric cars and electric vehicles, and we're going to, the whole new like Green New Deal is that we're going to build all this new infrastructure. Well, to build all this new infrastructure, we're going to have to mine lithium, and we're going to have to build batteries, and we're going to create jobs. And I'm like, okay, that's all true, and that's maybe a good political argument to make, but that doesn't tell me anything about how we will preserve the earth, how we will share space, how we will protect others and care for others. And we don't hear that in our political discourse anymore. So I want the mobile commons to become a way to talk about those other ways of thinking about how we move through the world more justly.
Okay, let's go in the remaining 15 minutes to the 5 key ideas you presented as a manifesto to take action. I would like you to explain for us each one of these 5. And I have to take advantage of this moment to ask all the people, colleagues following us, that I don't have time to make you all the questions we have, but we are keeping all these questions, and we will work with these questions for the journals and the different activities, investigations we will keep doing during the next year and a half, because these talks are supposed to inspire us. It's just the beginning. It's not the end of what we are doing. So all these questions are precious. But I have to ask Mimi, for the five actions you suggest. If you can further explain us. The first one, maybe I can quote you, and then you can further explain it. What do you mean by that? The first one, struggles over everyday embodied relations of racialization, gender, age, disability, sexuality, etc., which inform uneven freedoms of mobility and unequal capabilities for mobility. What do
So,
you mean by that? What are the political implications of this for you?
right. So starting at that, so what I did is I kind of organized these according to different scales of action, although understanding that those scales are entangled and they're related to each other. But if we start from the scale of the body and we think of ourselves as inhabiting different positionalities, and those are racialized, gendered, sexualized, aged, more or less disabled in different ways. And through our life course and through our social position and our geographical position, we experience uneven mobilities and differential mobilities in a variety of ways. And so there's constantly struggles happening, which I call kinopolitical struggles, over our capabilities to move. And so that those are specific, there's specific movements, like movements for the rights of people with disabilities, right? For access and accessibility in cities. There's rights for women's freedom of movement, right? To be able to move without fear of sexual violence and murder. There's femicides, right? Murders of women and the attacks on women are happening all over the world now. Racialization, right? Which leaves people vulnerable to all kinds of racist attacks in public space. So like the rights of aged people, right? To be able to cross a street without being mowed down by a car, or bicycles being run over and hit by car drivers and they get away with it. So all of those are everyday embodied struggles that are happening all the time. And in our cities and elsewhere, like there's political fights over that and controversies over that. And so the first aspect of mobility justice, right, is to support and fight for a more fair and just and less violent, less racist, sexist, world of being able to move. And also, I should say struggles over mobility are also struggles to dwell, right? And who has the right to dwell, to pause, to rest, to sit on a bench, to put a tent up somewhere, to be a vendor in a market stall. Those are also part of those relations and struggles over mobilities. And I should say you've seen I've blended to the next scale, which is the second one, which is the struggles for the right to the city and the public sphere.
Let me ask you something more about the first one.
Okay.
Because I in practical terms, it seems that the first struggle, this first idea may have deep implications in the way, for instance, we design public transport, in the sense that instead of transporting as many people as possible, as fast as possible, as cheap as possible, if we take seriously this first statement, we have to realize that the public transport is maybe the place where people from very different income, age, gender meet together for different purposes. So it has a social value which is precious. So we are not just transporting people. We are creating a place where people so different with so different purposes go together. And this is something that has been neglected really until now. It seems
Absolutely.
luxurious. It seems luxurious. Only
Yes.
very wealthier cities in the US or especially in Europe can afford this. If you go to megalopolis in Latin America, it's about transporting people, as many as possible, as fast as possible, as cheap as possible.
Okay, I agree in some ways with that, but I also see, there's wonderful work being done now on informal transportation in cities of the global south or the east. And collective, informal collective transportation is also, I mean, it has to be cheap and affordable, but it's also a space of sociality, and it's a space of culture and art, and as people decorate their vehicles. And I've just joined the advisory board of the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation, and we're trying to build a new kind of understanding of the importance of those social and cultural spaces as also important transportation systems. And I would say, like, when I first moved to live in England, and I rode buses much more than I did in the United States. And the bus was a way for me to observe and see this new culture around me, and to understand the different kinds of people, and like listen in on conversations and watch people. Right. So yeah, it's incredibly important as a space of, there's an urban ethnographer here in Philadelphia named Elijah Anderson, and he's written about what he calls the cosmopolitan canopy. And he was talking about sort of our big train station, 30th Street Station, and our big food market, Reading Terminal Market, as these canopies that protected this space of this like listening and seeing and being with other peoples. But you could say the bus or the subway system also does that, even if it's crowded. I mean, when you're waiting on the subway platform, you're also like seeing many, many people, and yes. And yeah, that's a really important social space.
Yes, let's go to the second scale and your second suggestion for the manifesto, which is the right to the city, which recalls Lefebvre, really, and the public sphere, often with a politics of occupation and presence in public space that disrupts normalized mobility spaces and offers epistemologic alternatives.
Yes, and there I was picking up on Lefebvre's right to the city, and you know, and as well as Soja's work on spatial justice, but also his theorists and histories of the public sphere. And I had worked in the past on the idea of subaltern publics and counter publics, and you know, I was thinking of movements that disrupt the flow of traffic. So the Occupy movements that were happening are one way to think about that, occupy public space, but also the reclaim the streets movements that tried to sort of bring people and bicycles and to sort of challenge car traffic. But now we see the Black Lives Matter movement, right, doing similar things. Again, in some cases where the movement spills over onto highways or onto, you know, traffic places and stops the traffic. That's a very important form of political intervention and protest. And it, in many of those cases, when I say it offers epistemic alternatives, it's because these movements have tried, like Occupy movement, Reclaim the Streets, and Black Lives Matter, have tried to enact a different world, right? They've tried to show through their actions a different way of being together in the world and moving through the world together. So those are, I think, really important types of social movement, and mobility is part of social movement that we need to protect. They're like the foundation of democratic publics, which I understand not in the sort of liberal European tradition, but is coming out of the revolutions of the Atlantic world and the anti-slavery movement. As
you also emphasizes, Mimi, struggles over, you call ethical spaces for contesting borders, migration, and other kinds of transnational mobility, slavery, trafficking, deportation, refugees, etc., in contested contexts of secularization and militarization.
Yes, and here we come to that question of like the global mobilities and transnational movement across borders. And so much in the world in recent years has been about securing borders, the militarization of borders, the building of border walls, the stopping of refugee movements, the turning back and leaving people to die, right, in the Mediterranean or in the deserts on the US-Mexico border. And it's tragic. I mean, it's tragic that we are at this point in global history right now that some of us are living within a protected fortress, which back in 2001, Jeanette Verstraete was writing about Fortress Europe, right? And the creation of Schengen space that united Europe, but then built a kind of wall around Europe. And we need to talk about that in a different way. And I think there are what some call the no borders movement, poses this idea of an ethical space to contest our current migration regimes that are so exclusionary and leave others to die. And I come from a history of people who were refugees, people who were escaping genocide, people escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe, and so to me, it's really important that we take a stance on that in the world today.
Okay, and the last key idea of your manifesto, the struggle is over the just circulation of goods, resources, energy, etc., in a global capitalist system that lacks procedural justice in the distribution of planetary matter and in the logistics infrastructure that move that stuff.
Yes, and there I'm thinking of that planetary scale and what some now call Anthropocene mobilities. So the mobilities of energy, of metals, of the logistics infrastructure that moves all of these things around the world, and that it's an unjust system right now, right? It's an extractive system. And even when we talk about green infrastructure, we need to challenge the extractive systems that are embedded in moving and building and expanding. This means that we need to have a better understanding of where things come from, how they're moved, what are the labor forces, what are the human rights violations, but also the rights of nature, right? How are mountains and earth and oceans being exploited through the current extractive economies, even in some of the green economy scenarios?
Okay, let me ask you two more things. We are very interested, even though we are just about 1 hour. We knew that 1 hour is too short, but anyway, the first is about your vision of the future. Jane Jacobs, I think her last book was Dark Age Ahead. So Jane Jacobs, I think, will be very much in line what you are thinking and working for sure. I mean, the idea of the street level and so on, all of this will be, I think, in line with Jacobs' view. And she was very pessimistic. Her last book, the one in which he calls transport engineers as the incurious profession, just because we lack the capacity to understand many of the things we have been talking about now. What is your view of the future? These two extreme views, the little sisters with, people organize themselves, sharing and technologies helping us, blockchain, this idea of bottom-up and kind of decentralization and empowerment of diverse people, or the idea of the big brother, the idea of kind of protections, surveillance, control. So what is your expectation in terms of the change in people values as well as in the impact of technologies going on?
I would just say, because we only have a minute.
Yes. And another question.
I take much inspiration, and always have, from protest movements, social movements and struggles over a long course of history. So, people overcame slavery and changed the entire world economy, right? And labor systems of forced labor. And we get new problems, right? And new forms of coerced labor come again, but then people struggle against them and change them. Same with women's movements and struggles, right? We had oppression of women, and they fought against it, and it changed, but then it comes back again. So I see these things as not, a dark age or bright age, optimism, pessimism, but like that it's a constant struggle, and that we need to keep fighting the good fight and supporting the causes that we believe are more just and are ethical.
Okay, I see. we have to create the future more than thinking on, yeah, I see the tradition this comes from. Now, let me ask you about how much the pandemics have changed or reinforced your thinking. You just published 4 weeks ago a book that I still don't have, but I will buy as soon as possible. Advanced Introduction to Mobility. You just published 4 weeks ago, you told me. So is the book includes your more recent, exactly. Your book includes your more recent thinking on all of this uh, with the experience of the pandemics that has been huge shock. So what do you think now? You still believe the same or in a different way after the pandemics?
Yeah, well, so I wrote the book kind of looking back at sort of 10 years of mobility studies and kind of trying to describe the field while also trying to capture this current moment that we're coming through. And also we did a special issue of the journal Mobilities on pandemic mobilities, so that this thinking is also related to that journal issue, which has a number of great contributions. So I'll just say that I like the Indian writer Arundhati Roy. She wrote about the pandemic is a portal, and it's a portal that we are moving through, and we can decide, do we want to bring with us the baggage of the past and all the problems of the past, or do we want to try to let go of some things and walk through this portal of the pandemic and try to build a new world of some sort and leave behind some of the old baggage? And that's a nice mobile metaphor, I think, for how we might treat the pandemic as an opportunity to do things differently, and while understanding that that word opportunity is very problematic, but it's a portal for us to do things differently, and it's a portal for us to try to face the crises that I said are this triple crisis that is extremely urgent, right? And I believe, that this is a chance for us to do that, and that the pandemic has reorganized our mobilities deeply. It's not just demobilized things, but it's remobilized things. It's been a massive disruption of mobilities at many scales, right? Individual mobilities, urban mobilities, tourism and business and all kinds of migration. Everything has been disrupted and changed. And what can we learn from that? And it's still ongoing. So can we learn something from this vast reorganization, demobilization, and remobilization of how we might operationalize a change towards a more sustainable future?
Great. Thank you very much, Mimi, for sharing with us this time. We appreciate very much all
You're welcome.
all your work, and you just published this book for us. So just on time. Thank you very much as well, and thank you all the colleagues following this conversation with all the time devoted to write insights, comments, suggestions for us that we will take aboard for sure. So thank you very much, Mimi.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions and a great conversation.
Okay, see you soon. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.